Thank you for that introduction, Monica, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We have a lot of subject matter specialists to come who will talk about the challenges and opportunities of innovation in a changing world in their specific fields and workplaces. I want to kick us off by talking about what I see and hear in my beat here at the FT of politics, power, and public policy globally, and the political and external headwinds facing businesses as a result. Fortunately, it's a well-timed week to be talking about innovation in a changing world. We've grown used to seeing stunning developments in the field of artificial intelligence, much of it driven by the researchers at OpenAI. What is clear is that across every aspect of life, how we live and work with artificial intelligence, and with generative AI in particular, is going to be the biggest and most far-reaching change, at the very least, since the invention of the internet. Given we aren't still wholly clear on what the ultimate consequences of the invention of the internet are, I'm not going to speculate on what the ultimate consequences of the development of generative AI, when full scale, greater than human intelligence will be achieved, or if that is even achievable. I don't know what the consequences will be, and I don't think it's all that helpful to guess. What we do know is those consequences will be large and far reaching. Understandably, the debate over those consequences pits those who favour an innovation at all costs, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead approach to innovation versus a softly, how do we avoid destroying ourselves and benefit humanity approach. Now, both those positions are caricatures, but they are useful ones. I think people who worry about AI risk and the cost to humanity, broadly speaking, the EA effective altruism tendency, are correct to say that sooner or later we're going to develop intelligences greater than our own, and this is going to be a huge deal for humanity. I think the so-called EAC movement, effective accelerationists, the don't worry, be happy AI researchers, can sometimes be too Panglossian, far too quick to dismiss concerns about risk. But they're right to say that ultimately you can't really stop innovation. Knowledge can't be unlearned. Just look at the various attempts by governments to ban encryption in communication, for an example of that. Any two people can sit together and work out a fail-safe encryption and only they understand. That knowledge can't be lost and unlearned. We were given a further example of the futility of stopping innovation this week too. Once again, we saw a stunning development courtesy of the researchers of OpenAI, this time in corporate governance. This isn't a speech just about AI, but I think there are three broad things worth noting about Sam Altman's off again, on again relationship with OpenAI and its near wholesale remaking of its board. The first is that staff matter, particularly highly skilled, highly sought after staff. If you can't, as OpenAI's board could not, carry most of your staff with you, you're very unlikely to be able to succeed. Yes, in some cases, when technology or a labour market shifts power away from your people, you can get away with it. But those cases don't pop up very often, and shifts in technology in the labour market can just as easily hand power to your people and away from you. The second is you can't stop innovation, or at least the private sector can't. Whether at OpenAI, Microsoft, or somewhere else, research and innovation are going to take place. Now, that isn't much comfort if your workforce or your government stops you innovating. Trade still takes place in Europe after Brexit, after all, but for British companies and workers who have a smaller share of that trade, that is cold comfort. It is, however, an important argument to make when you face internal or external opposition. Yes, innovation can be painful, but it can't be stopped. The only choice is to be on rather than under the bus. The third, closely linked to the second, is that governments are going to inevitably take from this that they are going to be the ones who do the heavy lifting as far as regulating innovation in the AI space is concerned, for good and for ill. The big myth of the EA safety crowd has always been to say that they're working on a technology every bit as transformative and risky as the development of nuclear weapons, but then the solution could be found by getting a non-profit to oversee a for-profit company. A lot of AI researchers like to compare themselves to Oppenheimer, but nuclear proliferation was only ever going to be managed by states, not individuals or companies. The lesson that governments are already taking is they're the only game in town for these new technologies. Now, the good news is governments have the popular legitimacy that the rest of us lack. The bad news is they tend to be better at regulating to avoid harm than fostering innovation. And the second piece of bad news is governments tend to regulate only after a disaster. And if the AI risk warriors are right, then we aren't likely to get a do-over on regulating AI. Nonetheless, we are where we are. Governments are going to take the lead on regulating AI and innovation, just like they do on almost everything else. Note, though, that I use the word governments plural there. The paradox is that, as recent events have reminded us, competition drives innovation, and no amount of localized political or social pressure can stop it entirely. Knowledge can't be unlearned. So, fortunately or unfortunately, only governments working together in concert can really pull the brake on innovation. And the forces driving governments apart and making global cooperation harder at a political level are still very powerful. But because of those forces, how you can innovate and who regulates you will be decided by multiple governments in different places. The bad news is that many of these governments will be anti-innovation and will make your lives harder. Yes, there are bright spots. In Poland, Donald Tusk has defeated the PiS government and potentially turned the tide against populism there. Here in the United Kingdom, whatever one thinks of the political choice on offer, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer both represent a repudiation of the populist tide within their parties, albeit potentially only a temporary repudiation. Over the next 12 months, we will see elections in the world's largest democracy, India, and the world's most important democracy, the United States, that will show that the forces of division, populism, and nationalism are still very powerful. Can Donald Trump win again? The answer is clearly yes. We can see that Trumpish candidates are underperforming more moderate Republican Party ones at elections, but it's far from clear that underperformance will be large enough and geographically dispersed enough for Joe Biden to be re-elected. If Joe Biden wins again, that will, of course, be a particular relief for those of us here in Europe, given what Trump has said about the war in Ukraine, and a relief for American democracy, given what Trump has said about the 2020 election. But the Trump effect will persist regardless. Biden's government is more protectionist and more interventionist, in part because of Trump's victory in 2016. At a local and federal level, anyone who does business in America will have to contend with radical experiments of one kind or another, whether the unorthodox anti-crime, or perhaps that should be pro-crime, policies of the US left in some cities, or the socially conservative and pro-censorship policies of the US right in some state legislatures, such as Florida. Because, as I said earlier, the United States remains the world's most important country, and because it drives conversation everywhere, what happens there matters a great deal. Equally importantly, the things driving polarization and division in the United States are the same things roiling politics the world over. What are those things? Well, innovation is in of itself one of them. Changes in how we communicate mean that we can curate our own news environment. Businesses of every kind can service our needs better and in a more individualized manner. These two things create higher expectations for public services and for government. Understandably, people want and expect as high a standard of delivery from the state as from the private sector. Added to that, innovations in medicine and healthcare mean people live longer and cost more. Here in the United Kingdom, I'm speaking to you on the same day as the government sets out its spending plans. Successive Conservative finance ministers have struggled to get out from under the shadow of what the Conservative governments of the 1980s achieved. It's illustrative to look at the demographic challenges faced then and now. In the 1980s, most of us died in our 70s and 80s, often as the result of some kind of cardiovascular incident, a heart attack, or a stroke. Now, many more of us are living into our 90s and dying after a long period battling overlapping comorbidities. It's good that many of us are living longer and fulfilling lives, but it does also cost more. We also know more. The era in which Francois Mitterrand, as president of France, could have a mistress, a second family, and a secret illness in office is now long past. So when we talk about how the corporate and political leaders were giants compared to the pygmies we have today, a big part of that unflattering and I think wholly misplaced view is that today's leaders face greater exposure to scrutiny than ever before. And for some people, the innovation has meant the loss of jobs and or their status. Take all that together, high expectations of what government can and should do, higher costs for what governments already do, and resentment at that loss of income and prestige, and you have the petri dish for the various populist eruptions we've seen the world over and will continue to see. Those political forces also pose challenges for business leaders too. Anxiety about job security and status is the biggest part, I think, of why diversity and inclusion efforts are controversial and provoke anxiety. Yes, for a minority, their opposition to those efforts are driven by straightforward sexism or bigotry, but that's a largely trivial minority. For many more, their anxieties are driven by legitimate concerns over what those efforts mean for them. Just as political leaders have to navigate the demands to be as responsive and effective as modern business leaders, increasingly business leaders face demands from their own staffers and customers to speak about political and social causes. Almost every leader now faces pressure to lead a full service organization, if you will, not in terms of marketing or financial advice, but in terms of political and social activism. There are two big challenges to innovative leadership here. One is the political and democratic pressures driving those forces in the political world mean that states pull the brakes on innovation. The second is the demand from within organizations from clients to speak on issues of social and political concern ultimately drags you away from your core purpose, alienates other and less vocal staff members and clients, and gets you into a lot of difficulty. How can leaders navigate this storm? I think there are some broad principles that are helpful here, but I'm sure many others will disagree, while hopefully other speakers will add greater depth and insight. Leaders will need to know code and to speak code. I don't mean that you should be able to muck in with your product team or develop your own large language models. The days in which understanding COBOL, the deeply unpleasant and hard to use coding language that undergirds much of the world's technological infrastructure, guaranteed you a boring but well-paid job for life, have been put to an end by AI. But if we do want machines to kill us, making AI handle COBOL does seem like a good way to give them a legitimate grievance. But seriously, what I mean is you need to be able to understand how these things work, what their limitations are, and to be able to talk about them to your workforce and your clients. The basic fundamentals of what this technology does and means have to be within the toolkit of all leaders, whether you run an organization, you're head of its HR, or you run a team within that organization. That knowledge also allows you to be clear-eyed about the limitations of that technology. Two parochial UK examples are a good indication of the importance of that. In the private sector, almost a decade ago, a crash at the Alton Towers theme park saw two people end up having life-changing injuries. Subsequent investigation found workers had overridden the computer. They dispatched a safety car, which didn't come back, and when the system stopped working, they decided they knew best without checking. When humans do not work well with the machine, tragedy can strike. But equally, when humans treat the machine as an all-knowing and mysterious god, things can go wrong too. After the closure of schools, British politicians tried to use an algorithm to allocate grades. I use that word algorithm very generously in this context, as they had no decent data to do it with. Unsurprisingly, this algorithm did not command public support, and it may well have set back the use of data in UK government policy by years as a result. Leaders of all kinds need to know how this stuff works, and to be able to talk about it with their workers and clients. Most of all, the best way to navigate the storm is to be clear both with yourself about what you want to achieve and with others. The age of transparency that means a French president can't have a secret mistress or a hidden illness means that the days in which corporate strategy could be kept locked in a black box somewhere are also over. You have to be able to communicate your intentions and to have the courage to stick to your plan. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day.